Hi, I'm Ashley with Campbell. Thanks for investing your time to help your community be a great place to live. Before you watch the video, make sure to click the subscribe button so that we can help you make educated decisions as a board member.
Okay, thank you, Ashley, and good afternoon, everyone. Really thrilled to be here with you all. It's Matt Kuisle with Reserve Advisors, and I am the Regional Executive Director for a firm that works nationwide on reserve studies. I've been doing reserve studies personally for about 25 years. I'm a professional engineer and a reserve specialist, as well as a professional reserve analyst. And like many of you, I am a volunteer community association board member as well. So I've spent what's feeling like a life sentence, but has been about 15 years on my community association board. Now I live in a condo. So like Ashley said, a lot of this today is not going to apply directly to me in my condominium association, but this geared more towards homeowners associations in the state of Florida. So let's jump right in to the material. We're going to talk a little bit about the operating budget versus the reserve budget, just setting a little bit of a foundation for the two. I want to talk about why reserving, why it's so important for communities to look at their reserves. We're going to talk about the statutory requirements, again, specific to homeowners associations in our state, as well as some best practices, funding options, funding methodologies that we'll get into and that we've learned again, from doing studies for thousands of communities over throughout 50 states and actually 30 countries. Our firm works all over the place, and we'll leave some time for questions at the end. So let's jump right in. I know it's early. It's March 18th today. Happy belated St. Patrick's Day to those who celebrate. But is it too early to start talking budgets? I mean, it's usually the budget season is in the fall, but I've been talking with people a lot, and the budget season almost never really stops anymore. It is something that we have to be thinking about year round, and this is a great time to start thinking about the longer term items on our reserve study. So I hate to be Debbie Downer to you all, but it's budget season is only a few short months away, and this is a great time to start thinking about it. So good timing for this webinar, and thank you again for participating today. Let's jump in quickly. The operating budget versus the reserves. So generally, the operating budget looks at day-to-day operations of the association. We look at items that occur regularly, at least annually, if not more frequently. Things like administration, management, maintenance, insurance, which is a huge one, any taxes, security, fees, all of those items generally on your annual operating budget, your maintenance items that happen year after year after year. Now, many documents restrict increases, and we see this, I think, more in homeowners associations than anywhere else, where the operating budget assessments cannot exceed, say, 10%, 15%, 5%, even in some cases, of the prior year's assessment. And this puts associations in a very difficult position, but makes, again, all the more important to look at your budget alternatives, look at your budget requirements, and think of ways to make sure that you're not coming up in a situation where you're going to have to exceed your governing documents allowance for increases from year to year. Now, sometimes these are unavoidable. We've seen this in some cases where there's a unit order meeting to consider a budget that exceeds that and getting approval. Just think it's just incredibly important to stress the need to communicate and be transparent now more than ever with communities' budgets. Hey, Evan.
Hey, Matt. Sorry, everybody. Had a little Wi-Fi technical difficulty. I'm actually at a large HOA right now, so happy to join you.
Very nice, very nice. And we were just getting started talking about the operating budget and how that many documents can restrict the amount that it could increase year over year. And so my advice there would just be to be transparent with the ownership if that's necessary. I think some owners would like to hold you to that restricted a document amount, but in some cases, that's not going to be an acceptable solution because you have to, say, for example, insure the property still, even though it might be higher than the assessment. Evan, any advice for folks that are in that situation?
Yeah, I've dealt with it a few times. I highly recommend involving your association council. There are situations where the necessity, as you said, overrides the documents potentially, but you want to get a legal opinion on that. So the board's on solid ground when they approach the membership, and if there is any complaint that goes further than that. So definitely recommend getting counsel involved there.
Yeah, and I've seen some of them where they were really, there's certain carve outs that would not be included in the assessment amount. So if you said this, for reserves, or if there's a one-time item, that might not fall into the calculation. So great advice there. Yeah, take a real close look at that if you're coming up against that, if your documents restrict it, the increases from year to year. But again, and in those cases where you have that, it's good to be aware of that, because I've seen associations where maybe they don't need maybe they don't need as big of an increase one year, but they know that they're up against that each year. So they may even build in a slight increase every year just to make sure they're not falling way behind in a period of low inflation, that they can make sure they're staying on track and keeping up with really the costs around us. And that'll be a theme, I think, throughout this, whether it's operating budget or reserves, is realizing the true cost of ownership and what it really takes to maintain our communities.
Sure.
Anything else on the operating budget? Otherwise, I'm going to go to this other portion of the budget here that is a little bit of an unknown, the black hole, some call it, of reserves.
Sure.
Okay, so the reserves are in HOAs. They're not as well defined, I think, than we see, and we'll talk about the specific statutory requirements. But in HOAs, there's no specific list that says all HOAs have to reserve for their roofs and the painting or the paving or whatever it might be. So we rely on the National Reserve Study Standards, which are actually now the International Reserve Study Standards. These standards were developed by Community Associations Institute back in the 90s, actually, and were just revised. They're being used throughout the world now as the standard for developing reserve studies. And the most important thing, if you do one other thing on your reserve study, the very most important thing is to make sure you get the right items on the schedule. Make sure you're reserving for the components that are appropriate for your community. And there isn't, especially with HOA, there isn't a one-size-fits-all list. So the national standards have developed this three-part test. And they say, well, if an item is an association responsibility and it passes test one, of course, we're not going to reserve for items that the homeowners maintain or that the city maintains. If the useful life and cost is reasonably anticipated and estimated, the cost can be reasonably estimated, then it passes. If it passes those three-part tests, it's likely going to be a reserve item. Now, one other piece, and I think is kind of goes under that anticipated, is it's not an everyday expense. Again, remember, it's not an annual expense. It's things that happen less frequently than annually. So commonly in an HOA, we see things like the roads. Sometimes that's the biggest individual expense that we see, and everyone drives on them every day and is well aware, if they're the association's responsibility, that some sort of treatment, overlayment, something's going to be needed for those roads. So they develop a reserve to take care of those items. Amenities like pools, clubhouses, all certainly items that people are well aware won't last forever, will need some repairs. Now, you likely wouldn't reserve in most cases for complete replacement of your clubhouse, but you would look at replacement of things like the roofs and the air conditioning, windows and doors, renovations to the kitchen or bathroom. In the pool, you have obviously the finish, the deck. We see furniture there. The tile, the coping. Looks like there may be a spa in the corner. All of those items would be common reserve components in your HOA as well. Now,
So
go ahead.
one thing I'd want to mention, Matt, we always get the why. Why should we do this? And I mean, as board members, you guys are supposed to be fiduciaries, protecting the asset value and the investment that you have all made as homeowners. If you add up all the homes in your community, say you have 300 homes and they're $500,000 each. I mean, we're talking about 150 million, I think, right? 150 million in property value. That's really significant. That's the asset that you're in charge of. It's not just your own home. It's not just the clubhouse. It's looking out for everyone's property value. There's developers building new communities every single day here in South Florida, and their amenities are newer, nicer, cleaner than yours. And if you're not putting money aside to keep up with the newer developments, it's going to be reflected in the property values of your home and your neighbor's home. So although these numbers sound big to us as individual homeowners, we can't conceive of spending $1.5 million on repairs for roads. That's just more money we ever spent on anything. It's a drop in the bucket when you're trying to preserve $150 million of asset value, which is what a lot of you guys are doing. So.
Great point. Yeah, and I always remind associations they're not for profit, but they are businesses, and they really need to think like a business when it comes to that. And your main role, I think, is to protect the value of the property and protect everyone's investment. That's why I'm on my condo board where I live, is I want to make sure that we're protecting those big assets. Some of the biggest assets that I have is my home, and of course we got to look out for everyone's there. So these are the things, and again, the things that people see every single day and realize, this is part of the home, part of the community where we live. And really the first thing that a prospective buyer is going to look at when they come in.
Yep.
And you're right. So that, they're going to see the pool, the clubhouse, the roads. And so the aesthetic and the curb appeal there is just as important as the functionality in a lot of cases. Yeah.
The first place they're going to go before they look at your home to buy or after they look at your home to buy is the clubhouse. And it's going to leave a lasting impression, especially when they go visit neighboring clubhouses. And some of them have been remodeled and maybe yours hasn't. So.
Right. And then there's, so there's the real front of mind things for everyone. And then, like I was mentioning, the biggest mistake we see is people leaving off pretty significant components of their reserve schedule because they may not be as readily apparent or as visible. Now, of course, the tennis court and the fences and the entrance monuments on the left-hand side, sure, those are pretty important items. But things like curbing and drainage, the pond shorelines, irrigation systems, other infrastructure, all of that adds up. And if we don't have funds to replace those things, generally those types of components really get a lot more expensive if we don't address them in a timely manner. So we might want to put, and there's pressure, of course, to make the pool look great, just like we got done talking about. It's important to make sure the clubhouse looks great. There's also this demand for some of the other infrastructure items that often get overlooked in an HOA. Again, there's no one list for every HOA. There's no one set of requirements, but all these things could be considered. And that's where the reserve study helps. And I think that's, like I said, the first thing we do there is a physical analysis where we classify all the property, identify what are the items that this community should be reserving for, whether they're mandated by state or not to do it. What are the things that are going to wear out? What are the things that are going to pass that 3-part test? And then we conduct an assessment of the condition, quantity, of course, how many square yards of pavement are going to impact the cost valuation of the pavement, the useful life, remaining useful life, all play into the reserve study. So the reserve study is going to be a third-party assessment of the physical property. And as a reserve study provider, I can tell you this is where we put 95% of our time is on the physical assessment side, making sure we get the right items, the right useful lives, and the right costs. After that, it's kind of a math exercise of just running a financial cash flow, typically identifying where the fund is starting, what contributions you need to make to cover the expenditures. And the idea is just to make sure that you've always have enough money for those expenses that you've identified there.
Yeah. And one thing I'll bring up to the property managers and board members on the call is really invest your time when you're reviewing these things. You may not know what concrete costs, but you certainly know with what components you have in your community. And, there's a lot of reserve studies being done right now. There's a lot of different people doing them that maybe didn't do them a year or two ago. You really want to make sure that you're going through your property and making sure everything that you have is included. I've seen things included that they don't have, and I've seen things left off that you do have. And it dramatically impacts what you end up putting away if you miss a couple of key components. So make sure you check that list.
Exactly. And our reports, and a lot of reports will have, of course, the list of expenses that you had planned from reserves, but then we also have a couple categories of other items, things that maybe don't have that predictable remaining useful life, or things that aren't the association's responsibility to repair or replace. It's the homeowners maintain that, or the power company maintains the lights, or the neighboring community or the master association maintains the perimeter walls or gates. All of those things should be identified in your report somewhere. It shouldn't be part of what you're reserving for, but it should be something that you consider. And so that's kind of a helpful tool as you read the reserve study. Say, okay, what items are ours? What items maybe when we did the reserve study last time, we're below a certain cost threshold, or we were handling as operating maintenance, but maybe have become a bigger issue, and now we want to put some reserve for them, or items that, you know, when the community was brand new, had an indeterminate life, but now, and a good example of that might be like subsurface piping or drainage, concrete pipes, stored pipes below the roads. Well, you know, initially we're going to assume they're going to have a very long useful life, but if we start to see areas where maybe we learned that the backfill wasn't done properly, or that they were starting to get some clogs or things that cracking, dislodging of inlet or outlet structures over time, those may be things that we want to start putting into the reserve study that maybe initially we thought might last a little bit longer. So it's all there. There is a lot of moving parts, and great point, Evan, to really take a look at that. Every 3 years is kind of the standard interval of updates. But I think when we're in such a crazy inflationary environment, it may make sense to do a little more frequently. And on the other hand, if you don't have a lot of moving parts, you don't have a very small HOA with very minimum entities, maybe it goes a little bit longer. So I haven't touched on this a little bit, but you know, why reserves matter. We talked about protecting the investment. I think that's, you know, probably the biggest reason why we want to have reserves, because projects don't get done without money. It's just simple as that. Boards don't have the opportunity to do the project or sign contracts without some funds to do it, and without taking care of maintenance, repairs, replacements, costs will escalate. I hear a lot of times people say, you know, we can't afford to fund the reserves. And I get concerned when I hear that, and I challenge boards, if you heard that in your community, I challenge you to think about what your alternatives are. You know, we put two of them are on here that are very commonly used. When the community doesn't have reserves, they can get a special assessment or a loan. But I would argue, if you can't afford the reserves, which are a small monthly payment leading up to this project, can you afford the special assessment? Can you afford the loan, which might be spread out over time, but has now interest and fees on top of it? So does, you know, when we say if we truly can't, and there certainly may be cases where individuals are in a community where they can't afford to live because of their own personal situation, whatever it is, then they aren't going to be able to afford these other items as well. So I think it's inherent on the board, and Evan mentioned the fiduciary duty to kind of be transparent with that, and be clear to folks that, yeah, while we might not be reserving for these items, the alternative is when it comes due, we're going to have to send an assessment out to the community, which is a bit of a bad word in our industry, right, Evan? But it's unnecessary. It's unavoidable at times, right?
Well, right. Well, you can't do both. You can't not reserve and not assess, because now you're just completely neglecting your property. And that's not what the board's supposed to be doing. And the board can't just manage to the expectations of the people who can least afford to pay. The board has to manage to protect the investment of all the owners. One thing I say to people at HOA meetings sometimes is, you know, they're telling us they can't afford the assessment, they can't afford to fund the reserves, and it might be maybe the assessment's $1,000 an owner, maybe the reserves are $200 a quarter. I ask many of the people in the room, how many of you have remodeled your kitchen, replaced the roof on your home, remodeled a bathroom, installed a pool? I mean, people are buying homes in South Florida, investing $50,000 to $250,000 in their home. As the HOA, we're asking for $1,000 to remodel the clubhouse, resurface the tennis courts, replace the pool from 1970. You got to put some of these things in perspective. These people are spending 5 and 6 figures on their home. Spending a little bit on the association goes a long way.
For sure. And it brings up a common kind of concern that I hear at the board meetings where I go to is, well, we don't use that pool very often. I don't use the pool very often, but that doesn't mean that the next buyer, the person that's going to, you know, invest in the community isn't going to, you know, think that's very important, and think the pool is a important amenity that, again, is going to, you know, maybe that's not an option, you know, as a single family home to have a pool. And so they've got this option to get this community, and that's, you know, one of the difference makers in making a decision to purchase in your community versus another. So we kind of talked about that curb appeal maintenance. This is a section where I talk about the F word, the fiduciary duty of each board member, and the hat that we wear. Evan mentioned that as well. But I want to just add one thing. When we hear all the time, you know, I'm not going to be here in 10 years. I'm not going to be here in 15 years when that road needs to be done. Why would I worry about that, right? And I mean, I think that's a common conception in a lot of communities. Why would I pay for something that I'm not going to see when that money is spent. But we try to change that, I guess, from the first of all, from the board's perspective. Your duty implies that you cannot put your own personal interest in front of the duty. And so when I hear board members say, "Oh, I'm not going to be here," or "We're not going to be here," I say, well, what is the Homeowners Association Incorporated going to be here? Because that's where we're here making decisions. And if you're making decisions based on your own personal spot, I think you're towing a close line to be breaching that fiduciary duty of what's best for the community. So something to think about there. But then also on the homeowners, side of that, we try to get people to recognize that, you're, even though, you're not seeing the route, even though you might not see that road get resurfaced, you're enjoying the use and using that road every single day. And so it's a little bit of an equity idea of, each day in the Florida sun, the road's wearing and tearing. Every car that drives over it is one less car that, one more step towards the end of life of that road. And so everybody that, whether you live there for 6 months or 6 years or 16 years, the reserves are a way to kind of be equitable to the folks that are enjoying the use of that item. So it's more of setting aside funds. I like to think of it as setting aside funds for the wear and tear that's happening every single day, as opposed to setting aside funds for that one item, that one day that it gets repaved out 15 or 20 years. And then the last item on this slide is just safety and viability. I think that, that's again a more harmonious community. And then, there's one that is in good financial health and, of course, compliance with the law. So let's talk a little bit about statutory requirements for HOAs. I'm sure you hear a lot about condo statutory requirements, but we wanted to focus this right in on homeowners associations. And homeowners associations throughout the state kind of start at a point where they don't have reserves. Isn't that right, Evan?
Yeah, I mean, again, we'll talk about getting with counsel, but in general, the default is reserves are not automatically established and not required by statute unless certain criteria are met, which is what you're going through.
Yeah, so Florida Statute 720 is the Homeowners Association Act is what it's referred to. It's really the law, the Florida statute that applies to homeowners associations. And Section 303 talks a lot about budgeting and requirements there. And it says that an association is deemed to have provided for reserve accounts really only upon the affirmative approval of a majority of the total voting interests of the association. So in essence, if they don't have a majority approval of the majority of the total voting interests of the association, so I think 50% of the community plus one to get a majority, then in essence, they have not established reserve accounts. Now, there are some documents, very few, that would require some reserves or say that shall, but statutorily, in general, most HOAs do not get this vote and therefore do not have restricted or what I would call statutory reserves.
Mm-hmm.
And once they're established, then there's some rules that go into place for them and they're restricted to use. We'll talk about that in a second. But if they're not established, according to that paragraph, again, where you have a vote of the membership or the declaration obligates the developer to create reserves, the association, if they're responsible for repairing items, then they're going to result in a special assessment. Again, like Evan said, you don't really have the option to do neither. So if a community does not have reserves under paragraph D, which are statutory reserves, then there's a large statement and conspicuous type on all their financial statements written here, which essentially says that the lack of funding for these items may result in special assessments. And the rules about how you would actually attain a majority of the voting interest to obtain reserves. When you get that vote, it would be important, if you get that vote or if you're going to get that vote, it's very important to designate which components are going to be reserved for. And I think it's incredible. Anytime you're going to get a membership vote, you're absolutely going to want to involve your association council. There's so many I's to be dotted and T's to be crossed on those proxies and how you set this vote up. That you want to make sure it's done properly. But you want to designate the components, and then again, those reserves become restricted as to the use. Yeah, go ahead.
I've seen very, very few, if any, associations actually do this. I typically don't recommend it because I think you're just taking flexibility away from the board. I'm sure there's certain instances where it may make sense, but I think the board designating their own reserves when they're able to makes a ton of sense. And but it is worth checking with council. There are association documents that do have specific reserve language in them, and sometimes that language can put you in the statutory category, and sometimes it doesn't, even though it's in there. It's a very nuanced review. Some of these documents came out long before HOA and condo statutes were solidified. So make sure you do get with your council. If there's any question at all, whether you think your reserves are statutory or not, your association attorney is the one who's going to have to tell you that.
Right. And look, some associations have been around for 30 or 40 years. So was there a vote 10 years ago, 20 years ago by membership? Oftentimes, unfortunately, that's not exactly clear.
Right.
So I have seen, so that those are usually the cases where I have seen a vote taken, Evan, is where, you know, there's some discrepancy. There's some that maybe in the community that believe, yes, those should be statutory, or those are required, or want them to be statutory, especially after a significant amount of funds is accumulated in there.
Right.
There's those out there that, you know, say, well, that the next board can use them because they're not restricted and they're concerned about that. And then they'll take it to the membership to get a vote. But you're right. In my experience, it's absolutely the small minority of communities that actually have, of HOAs that actually have statutory reserves.
Right.
Most are what we would say voluntary reserves. So then the restrictions don't apply. So in essence, those reserve, you know, the business judgment rule is always going to apply. Your fiduciary duty is always going to apply. But if a board, you know, makes a business decision to not fund reserves one year, or to use some of that reserve money on another project that might be needed, as long as it's not a statutory reserve, typically that's okay. So there's more flexibility there, which I agree is a good thing most of the time for boards. But just good to be aware too that if you're concerned about that, then there is the option to get the owner vote to restrict them. And then the last kind of statutory language here is, again, that the reserves their use is restricted, so they must you know, remain in the accounts and shall be used only for their authorized expenditures, unless, again, the majority of the owners vote to do a use for other purposes. So that sometimes we see this at the annual meeting. If they have restricted reserves, they'll say, okay, well, in the beginning of the year, we want to allow the board to use them for other purposes. And then that gets at the kind of that same point of flexibility for the reserves. Because as good as your reserve study provider is, as good as I know we are at estimating and predicting, there are going to be unanticipated expenses that come up. There's going to be things that cost a little bit more or need a little bit sooner. And there's some flexibility, I think, is extremely important in all reserve plans. Well, let's talk about some of the methodologies for funding reserves, because I think this gets at that flexibility as well, and some things for folks to think about as they put their reserves together. There's two main methods for calculating reserves. One is the component method. I kind of call this the old school method. It certainly was extremely popular 30 years ago, before everybody had Excel spreadsheets that they were able to manipulate and use. Actually, there were some requirements in the condo docs that kind of forced people into this methodology pre-2002. So a lot of communities will still have component reserves. And so in essence, they're looking at a bucket for each item of reserves. They've got a reserve for paving, they've got a reserve for their ponds, they've got a reserve for the swimming pool, they got a reserve for their gates. And each of those monies get set aside for that specific purpose and can only be used on their specific purpose. The other methodology that most communities are moving towards, especially lately, is the pooled method, where you have one larger bucket to cover the same group of assets. Generally, you still have, you know, all of the items that pass that three-part test would be in there, but instead of restricting funds to an individual item, an individual replacement or repair, the pooled reserves can be dipped into for anything on the list of items that's in the bucket. So so I don't know if you want to add.
Way more flexibility there. That's typically our recommendation.
Yeah. And, you know, when like I said, 30 years ago, it was probably 90% of communities were doing component method. I think we're probably closer to like 80% doing cash flow method now. Pretty much everybody is migrating over because they see that works. It's unique as perspective, just for outside of Florida. Folks have other condos or HOAs outside of Florida. you almost never see the component method outside of the state of Florida. It's really the only state we ever see communities still using it, and it's becoming more minority. And one of the other big reasons for that, not just the flexibility, but and it's a little bit hard to visualize, but if you think about the need for cash flow, and if you've got buckets, now 4 buckets isn't a big deal, but you might have a community with 10 or 20 or 30 different buckets of funds. And if money can never be borrowed from one or the other, that each one of those buckets has to have something in it at all times, which really means you tend to carry much larger balances and require more funding from the membership to keep every one of those 30 or 40 buckets with something in it at all times. And you can't, again, you're building up that road reserve over 20 years, and it's always going to be building up in that bucket, and it can only be used for that amount. So even though you need to have another major project for somewhere else, you still have buckets and other 39 other buckets of money with some level of funding in it. So you never really get to get the benefit of the cash flow, which in most communities recognize, you don't have to replace everything all at once. Now, if you've got to replace everything all at once in your community, the two methods are pretty much the same as far as the funding amount, but usually the expenses are spread out over quite a bit of time, and that results in
Yeah.
the need for more funding for component compared to cash flow. I just had one where it was like triple the amount of near-term funds were needed to fill up all their buckets in the component method versus using a pooled analysis.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's much lower contribution typically on the cash flow method.
Yeah. So if you're in that position, if you're still using component method and you want to switch, first of all, again, you probably have to get your council involved, determine if it's statutory reserves or non-statutory reserves. Non-statutory would be, in my opinion, easier to switch methodologies. But the most effective way that we can help, or your reserve provider can help, is do a side-by-side comparison. Just run 2 pro forma budgets, one with component reserves, one with pooled reserves, and take a look at the funding requirements. And usually that's a pretty good way to get the owners to vote if it's needed to approve the migration over to the pooled reserve.
Mm-hmm.
So once we get the methodologies, we confuse things a little bit more with these different reserve strategies. And so these are identified again in the National Reserve Study Standards as goals, if you will, for your reserve fund. There's three goals. There's actually 4. There's a 4th one called statutory, but in Florida, all 3 of these work for condos and HOA. So we'll focus on these 3 today. Baseline funding, which essentially means the reserve contributions ensure that the reserve balance never reaches 0 at its lowest point, but never goes below 0. And this goal really aligns very closely with the Florida HOA statute, which says the cash inflows have to be sufficient to ensure that the cash outflows don't result in a balance that goes negative. So baseline funding is kind of the first level, the lowest level of funding. Threshold funding is essentially similar to baseline, where you look at all the expenses over time and you say, not only are we going to not drop below 0, we're not going to drop below a certain dollar amount or percent funded amount. And then on the other hand, the full funding, which is a term that gets widely confused and misused in our state, I believe, is defined as maintaining the fully funded balance. So what's the fully funded balance for an association? Well, it would be the portion of each item's cost that's used up. The calculation is there, but from just an example point of view, if you have a road that's going to last 10 years and it's $100,000, let's say, and it's in year 7, the fully funded balance of that road is going to be $70,000. In year 8, it's going to be $80,000. You do that same calculation at a snapshot in time for every item on the list, and you add all of those together, and you come up with the fully funded balance of the community as a whole. And then the percent funded, full funding means you have 100% of that on hand, and sometimes you'll see a percent funded. If you're 50% funded, you've got 50% of that on hand. And that's where we talk about percent funded, but full funding is maintaining that 100%. And so we're going to walk through a little example of this, a little case study, because it's easier to kind of show, I think, in numbers and graphs than it is. But this is another kind of way to think about it, where the cost to fund, again, is higher on full funding, more conservative than baseline funding. Threshold funding is generally in the middle as far as your risk level and the cost to fund. I tend to lean towards, and our firm tends to lean towards, recommendations of threshold funding. That's usually kind of the right size approach, in my opinion, but let's look at some examples of how that works. the baseline funding. So this would be the minimum. So this is a case study that we did. We just used the same expenses, same community, that resulted in three different funding goals. And we'll kind of look at the difference of each of them. So over the 30 years, this community kind of started with no reserves. Just a real high level look at this graph. The blue bars going below in the negatives are the reserve expenses. The green bars are the inflows that we're projecting over a 30-year period. And then this purple line that looks like a mountain peak here is the reserve balance. So you can see reserve expenditures. Some years we have nothing going on as far as reserve expenses. Some years we have big expenses all the way up to 250,000 here in 2048 or so. So this is the baseline funding where essentially we're building up reserves for, and I think I can use one of these laser pointers. Yeah, there we go. We build up the reserves over the first several years. We start spending some money, and then we really drain the reserves out here when we're doing maybe a bigger infrastructure project. The total funding is kind of cash in and cash out for this plan over the 30 years. It's 1.46 million being put in and just about that same amount being put out annually, assessing 49,000 in this example, which amounted to an annual contribution of $132 per owner. Small community, minimal amenities.
Mhm.
So we take that same plan and we say, well, what if we want to leave ourselves a threshold? Let's say the board said, we never, once we get some reserves, they're starting with nothing, as you can see in the first year. But once we get up to start to have some reserves, we'd kind of like to keep $100,000 as a minimum amount. We never want the reserve to drop below $100,000. And so that's this plan. And so it means we got to contribute a little bit more. In this case, I think it was $9 more, 141 versus 132. So you had $9 difference per year per owner, going from 49,000 a year to 52,000 a year, but leaving ourselves with this threshold. And this threshold is nice. Ian, Evan, do you see communities like to have that type of a threshold?
Yeah, it just makes sense. I mean, you're never going to project out 30 years of projects right on the nose, and I think things always end up costing more than we expect. So it's always our recommendation to either do the baseline or the threshold. I like threshold better. It just depends on your community. Sometimes 100's enough. Sometimes it needs to be 250, even 500. For some really massive communities that may have multi-million-dollar obligations. So it just makes sense. You want to leave yourself a cushion.
Yeah, and you're right. That cushion is kind of community dependent. It's a business decision that each board can make. One of the factors that we look at is, how far out are we? Are we really projecting expenses 25 years out? We know there's probably going to be a little more variance there as far as the accuracy. How big are the expenses? So if we've got, if you had $1 million expense, you'd probably want to leave yourself more than $50,000 as a cushion, because the $1 million expense in a given year, of course, could with change orders and just something of that magnitude would make sense. But then also I see some communities think about their uninsured or their items that aren't on the list. Storm cleanup, landscaping that might not be insured. We know there's a big liability there. We don't necessarily have a reserve line item for it, but they like to leave. Have you ever seen that where they like to leave a little cushion for the unknown?
Yeah. Right. As long as the reserves are non-statutory, they could be used for those purposes, which is great.
Yeah, I think it's good discussion to have amongst your board. And then this, again, the same community, same idea here, but we set the parameters of trying to get to 100% funded. And you can kind of see what happens here is this balance just no longer looks like a mountain where it goes up and down. It's just a steady ramp up into $1 million, which for this smaller community, never spending more than $250,000 a year, it's probably overkill, in my opinion. A little bit of overfunding in this case. Now, I do have some communities that say, this is where we want to be. We want to have $1 million because we've got $10 million worth of uninsured landscaping that we don't have on there, and they want to at least have some of that, or they've got $1 million deductible, perhaps on some of their infrastructure. So we will see, people try to get to that level, but I tend to agree with you, Evan, that this is probably more than justified for a community to target. And you can see that a 49,000 a year, which was the baseline, now they're all the way up to 79,000 a year, and money that hard to say that it's ever really going to be used. And so and then the contribution too in this case, because the expenses are pretty well spread out, it's quite a bit higher. I think it's about 80 plus dollars, almost $90 a month, $90 a year more for this, versus $9 a month for that, or $9 a year for that threshold plan.
Right. Yeah, I agree. I find this to be a little overly conservative, in some cases, very overly conservative when you look at how big the balances can get, and borderline inappropriate almost. Do you really want your HOA board sitting on $2 or $3 million that they aren't going to need? I mean, I would prefer that money be in my neighbor's pockets. The HOA can't really invest it very well, if at all. There's some strong arguments this is way too much.
Yeah. Yeah, you want to have enough, but yeah, you don't have too much. You certainly don't want to have too little, but
Yeah.
but I think you could have too much. Now, I will say when we get a case for an HOA, and some HOAs maintain roofs and paint, and that's all they maintain on a townhome. And if both of those happen to fall in that same year, and you got to replace all of your items at one time, then you actually really have to be like 100% funded. There isn't that much difference between the threshold or baseline and the full funding.
Right.
That's kind of the abnormality, or that's
But
the
the
exception.
math would shake out that way. The difference in owner contribution would not be very much in that community. It would
Correct.
Yeah.
Correct. Exactly. So something to think about, and just good food for thought as you look at your reserve funding plan. What are you targeting as you talk with your boards? The reserve report might come back and say, okay, here's what's required, but you really should think about. I want you to be aware of that those other goals or options out there for your community, and don't feel like you're obligated to follow this plan just because that's what's in the report.
Mm-hmm.
And then the last couple of slides here, then we'll get to some questions. I just want to ensure we talked about this a little bit, but updating the report, there's so many variables that can come on. The reserve study is really a snapshot in time. Every time we take a look, the next month or week or year afterwards, there's something that's changed in the community. Priorities change, costs are changing, technology is changing. And so sometimes the project get accelerated or deferred. Of course, our storms throw a wrench into everything when we have a big expense or items getting replaced through insurance. That's going to reset the useful lives and cause a need for an update. Sometimes adding or removing items, getting rid of your tennis courts and installing pickleball courts, those types of things can all impact reserves. We're seeing that a lot these days. And so just kind of thinking about up-to-date needs. Coordinating projects could be an impact. If you find out you need some piping work, well, maybe you want to do that before your pavement or in line with your pavement project, as opposed to maybe when it was planned out initially to be out a little bit longer. It might make sense to pull some things in and do them together. Those clubhouse renovations, instead of doing a piecemeal, may make sense to look at a wholesale renovation of those items. And again, aesthetics are important. And changes in technology are happening every day with things that might make it sense to replace something at a different time or using a different material that might be there initially. You have to be careful when you're, of course, changing the common elements. That's kind of a no-no, I think, and I think it's something you have to be mindful of. But at the same time, from a reserve and financial standpoint, good to be mindful of those different alternates and inflation. I mean, I just will stress that again. We saw, doing this a long time, we saw a period of like 6 years where we saw almost no inflation. And then COVID hit, and now we've seen just a rapid inflationary environment. And hopefully we're starting to see that cool a little bit. But each reserve study will include some assumption of inflation that's out there. And again, invariably, we're going to be off by whatever that is as time goes on. We won't predict that with any exactitude. If we did, we'd probably be in a different business, making more money probably too. So yeah, so again, just keeping the framework. We talked about some of these things. It's kind of more of a recap, but keeping surprises away. I really stress as a board, you're the management, you're the leadership, and having a plan in place like this, having a good reserve is going to build trust. It's going to build confidence in you as a board member and as a leader in your community, in the long-term outlook of the association as a whole, again, which is going to be good for your owners, your residents now, and of course potential buyers. I think it's an extraordinary selling point when you can, get realtors and folks that are selling units to understand, selling homes in your community to understand, there's a plan in place for these roads, and we do these on a regular cycle, and we've got a fund set up for that clubhouse to do a nice renovation in X number of years. It's been thought of, and again, it's going to maintain your curb appeal and enhance your property values, as demand for association living is not going anywhere, I don't think, in this environment, South Florida or the state as a whole. Almost every new community that's built is an HOA, and Evan already mentioned some of them very, very nice amenities that can make it a competitive environment. So as you look at that, think about transparency and then reduce cost of ownership. I think that's one of the things that I keep coming back to as we see costs escalating. The longer we wait on these projects, the less we are proactive, we can end up spending a lot more money and having to, could have been avoided if we had planned better in the beginning. Well, that's kind of our last slide here. We do have time for questions. Ashley, do you want to run through questions with us, or do you? I don't have the window open, but I certainly can.
Yeah, I pulled it up. I'm try to flip through here. Someone said their HOA is responsible for exterior maintenance, including roof paint and building repairs. Roof and paint are on a schedule. Building repairs occur randomly. They can be significant? Do they belong in reserves? I mean, yeah, that's a business decision for your board. It's hard to say without knowing the amount of repairs annually, but I certainly would be considering that because I know I'm going to have those repairs annually. But they could easily just be in the operating budget, and if it's a manageable number and it's been budgeted for every year and they get done, that's okay too. If their documents don't require which account they be in, as long as they're funded, and I don't think that's an issue. Someone asked, my understanding, builders were obligated to fund reserves from 2016 to 2021. I'll first start by saying I'm not sure that's 100% accurate, but I think there have been some court cases around that. And nearing turnover, how do we find out if our builder contributed? So every community that turns over from developer control to board control should be undergoing a turnover audit. So a independent CPA firm should be auditing the books for all the years the developer was there, and that turnover audit would be able to give you your answer if they contributed, and if so, how much and to what category. So make sure that you are looking at your turnover audit. One other thing I'll say about new communities, the best time to establish reserves is as soon as the board takes over. It is the least expensive time. It's the least impactful to the residents, and it gives you the most chance to kind of get things right and get money set aside. The longer you wait, the harder it is to implement, and each year that number that you need to put in the budget goes up and up and up. So try to get on it early. Matt, one for you. Who can we engage to do a reserve study analysis?
I happen to know some folks, I guess, reserve advisors. Of course, plug for my company. We've been doing it 34 years, and would love to work. One of the questions I just answered in the chat too is, we do work statewide. We work in 50 states, actually, in 30 countries. So I'd be happy to put our expertise to work for you as well. And another source would be, again, Community Associations Institute has a list of designated reserve specialists throughout the state, throughout the country. So you can go to CAI and search their directory of credentialed professionals and find a reserve specialist as well to work with you there, if it's not us.
So this is a good one, Matt, for you guys. Is there an industry standard methodology you go through when you're estimating these future costs? Some are easy if you know the square footage of a roof, perhaps, but some are more variable. How do you guys come up with these future costs?
Yeah, unfortunately, there's no industry standard. It's kind of a little bit of an art and a little bit of science involved with it. It's something like, I think painting was an item here. We're going to look at, yes, the square footage of paint, of course, how many gallons of paint are needed and how long it's going to take somebody to apply that paint, but also access to the paint, repairs that might be needed, sealants and trim and stucco, the type of substrate that is going on. It's really each individual company has their methodology of estimating these estimates. I like historical costs. If we know you just painted the buildings, we take those, and actually we're gathering those for thousands of communities every year and what actual costs, and we break that out on a per square foot, and we look at things like access height of the building, as you mentioned. That's all going to affect the equipment that's used, the immobilization, and try to come up with good estimates of real-time costs of what other communities are paying. And we try to apply those through our proprietary database to a community, your community, to get it as accurate as possible. But I, again, would just want to be clear, we're never going to get it exactly right. I don't think anybody's perfect in this area. The idea is to get in the ballpark and to ensure that you've got funds that are going to be in the very close ballpark of what your bids are going to come at. You're going to get bids that are going to have a spread on them, right? And so we're hopefully our numbers somewhere in that spread of between the high bid and the low bid. And of course, the important part too to look at there is what's the scope of work, because are you doing 2 coats of paint? Are you including the trim wood as replacement as a part of that scope of work, or is that going to be change orders? Those things are all things that we look at when we review your bids, and the engineers come up with an assessment of cost specifically for that question.
Someone asked me to reallocate funds from our general fund to the reserves. I think what you really mean probably is your prior year surplus. Generally, yes, that can be done with a board vote. You should check your documents and with council just to make sure. Every HOA's documents can be very different, but in general, that's typically allowed with a board vote. Someone asks, are we free to invest the reserve money? That's a tricky one. Most associations use FDIC insured investments, CDs, CDARS, money market accounts. If you're doing anything uninsured or that carries a risk of loss, I would absolutely check with association counsel. I've heard different things. Generally, that's frowned upon. Some others would say it's completely inappropriate. I would say if you're going outside the FDIC insurance world, check with counsel before you do anything. Let's see. Must reserves be 100% funded? That gets back to what we talked about. Are your reserves statutory or not? If you have statutory reserves, you must fund them 100%, or you have to get a vote to waive them. If you are not statutory, it means required by law to have reserves in your HOA, which again, most are not, then it becomes a business decision. It's not, is it 50 or 75%? It just depends on what are you responsible for? What is the appetite in your community for a special assessment or not? I mean, what my advice is typically if the community is very well-to-do, and that a special assessment is not going to be a burden on the board or the owners, and the owners would rather invest their own money rather than give it to the board and not earn as much interest, then assessments may not be such a big deal. If your community is heavily fixed income, that any shock to the maintenance, any special assessment is going to be very hard for the owners to contribute, that it's going to lead to turmoil, that it's going to be difficult for board members to pass that assessment. You should make sure you have 100% reserves so you never have to go to the owners to ask for money because you don't think you'll be able to get it. It's very case by case. Anything to add there, Matt?
Yeah, well, first the 100% funded thing, that goes back to that fully funded balance, and that might be a little bit more than's needed. Again, if you don't have to have 100%, I don't think, as long as you're looking at keeping it above a baseline amount. Some people think that is 100% because you're not waiving it on a statutory reserve, but it might be less than actually 100% of the fully funded balance. And then I echo what you say. I will say, we saw a lot of folks that took that approach for 20 years ago, 30 years ago, and saying, we'll write the check when it comes. When the time comes to write the check and it's bigger than you think, and maybe the folks aren't as affluent as they once were, or they've aged out a little bit, maybe running out and living a little longer than they anticipated, then that can become a problem. So think about, really want to think about what you're putting that next board, what situation you're putting that next board into. Is that going to potentially be an issue for them? Would just be one other consideration I would add there, Evan.
Yeah, no, it's good advice. A lot of people ask, can you change from component to cash flow without a vote? All of that goes back to, are your reserves statutory or not? And I do think there may be some condo people in here. I just want to be very clear. We're talking about HOAs only. That's homeowners associations organized under Florida statute 720. If you're a condominium organized under 718, basically nothing we've said applies to you today. So just be very careful that that you are an HOA under 720. If you are, it may just be a board vote to go from component to cash flow because you don't have statutory reserves, or it could be a member vote. So that's where you'd want to check with council to make sure you know the answer to that before you try to change. Let's see here. Yeah, a lot of this stuff. Sorry, go ahead.
Hal had a question that's kind of an interesting one. As a new HOA, how do we quickly ramp up reserves? Can the reserve be ramped downward year over year? Does the reserve amount have to stay the same year after year? Our goal is always kind of stable funding. We do have cases where, you know, maybe the assessment needs to be $100 a month, let's say, and you're at zero now. We do have cases where association will say, well, let's go 25, 50, 75 and get to 100 over a 4-year period. I think that's fine. And then again, in a non-statutory world, if it's statutory, you probably need a vote to waive the portion that's not up to that $100 a month, if that's what's required. And then we do see many cases where you're funding at a high level. Maybe you're playing catch up. You do a big project, and then your reserves can actually decrease after that project is needed to kind of as that useful life resets. So let's say you had the big road project, you really didn't reserve for it until 5 years out. You do the paving, now you got 20 years until the next one. It does make sense to reduce the reserve downward. Again, to keep that cash flow from getting the balance, you know, like we saw in those graphs, keep that from getting out of control, really, and just kind of keep that matching your outflows.
Right. I'm going to take one more question here because we are up against 1 o'clock. This was a really good one. Chris mentioned address the infrastructure components. The HOA may be responsible for stormwater collection, drainage, lake banks. A lot of reserve specialists say they don't evaluate things that cannot be visualized. That is a really great point, Chris. You need to look at what wasn't included on your reserve study, as Matt mentioned earlier, and you are responsible for. Some of those things can be very expensive. If you have private roads in your community, if you have lakes that you're responsible for, you're also very likely for stormwater, drainage structures, piping, culverts that run underneath those roads and in between those lakes and maybe out of your community into the local water management district. Those things may not show up on your reserve study. The lake banks may not show up on your reserve study, but they can be incredibly expensive to fix. Sometimes in some communities, even more expensive than the roads. So it's something you really want to pay attention to. Make sure you know what you're responsible for. And if you can't see it, did it get included in the study or excluded? Do you have anything to add there, Matt?
No, agree. I hate to hear that reserve provider says, well, if I can't see it, I can't include it, because we know it exists. We know it's somewhat predictable, and we know the dollars are big. So even again, if it's not going to be exactly right, start planning for those things. Evan's exactly right. Pond shorelines is probably maybe the number 2, if not the number 1 in a lot of communities right now. Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you, everybody. I wish we could get to every single question, but we just only have so much time in the day. I want to be respectful of everyone's time. Thank you for joining us. We do have future classes. If you go to campbellevents.org, that's campbellevents.org, you can sign up for future classes. We've tried to have a very specific HOA series this year. So anytime you see HOA in the title, that is going to be 100% geared toward your communities under Statute 720. We will only talk about HOAs and not condos, so as not to confuse everyone, and try to give the HOA people a little love, since the condo people have gotten a lot of attention recently. So that's it for me today. Matt, anything to say before we head off?
No, thanks very much for having me, and feel free. I know Ashley's going to send my contact if you do. Sorry we didn't get to all the questions. There's a lot of great interaction here, but if you have other questions you need that I can help with, feel free to send me a note and give me a call.
Thanks for watching. For more great educational content, click the subscribe button now.